It's part of our everyday lives. We trust our neighbors, fellow drivers, educators, co-workers, and it's larger than that. Our democratic institutions depend on a trust among citizens to ensure our system functions. Joining us now for more on the role of trust and how tragic events may erode it, in Palm Springs, California, via Skype, Bruce Schneier, author of Liars and Outliers, Enabling the Trust That Society Needs to Thrive. And with us here in studio, Randall Hansen, Canada Research Chair in Immigration and Governance in the Department of Political Science at the University of Toronto. Randall, it's good to have you back on the program. And Bruce, we're happy to welcome you back from California as well. Let us go back as we consider this issue of trust in society. Let's go back to the day before the shootings in Paris. And just tell us, Bruce, lay out a scenario for us. The average Parisian and the trust he or she would need to negotiate their way through an average day.
Well, it's the average person on the planet living in a community. You are constantly trusting strangers. I mean, today I flew in an airplane, trusting companies, trusting systems, trusting government regulations, trusting perfect strangers, maybe thousands of times. And society functions on trust at a very basic level. Without it, we're living at home, barricaded, and not speaking to anybody. When you really think about it, trust makes the human world go round. And I mean, certainly the tragic events in France erode some of that. But I mean, think of the solidarity last night on the streets of Paris. Millions of people trusting each other. So in some ways, trust is strengthened, even though it's weakened.
Well, I want to pursue that. And in doing so, let's remind everybody that in some respects, what you just described was what happened on the 6th of January. On the 7th of January, 11:30 local time, two gunmen storming the offices of the Charlie Hebdo magazine in Paris, shooting several people dead, including the magazine's editor, some of its cartoonists, 12 killed altogether, including a police officer. The next day, Thursday, the 8th of January, a 25-year-old policewoman is shot dead in the southern suburb of Montrouge. Police initially believe the shooting is unrelated, but later confirm the gunman knew the two brothers that attacked the offices of Charlie Hebdo. After a 3-day manhunt, we're now Friday, January 9. The two Charlie Hebdo attackers were killed by police in a small village 40 kilometers northeast of Paris. That same day, an armed man, later confirmed as the man suspected of killing the policewoman in Paris, opens fire in a Jewish grocery store and took hostages. A standoff ensued. The gunman was killed in an assault by the police. Reports later confirmed that 4 hostages were also killed and 4 wounded in the supermarket in Paris. Okay, let's sort of compare and contrast now where you believe the level of trust is in that society after all of that has now taken place. Bruce, to you again.
Well, it should be the same. I mean, this is a horrific event, but it's not common. It's extraordinarily rare. And unfortunately, what we see is people respond to rare and dramatic in strong ways. There probably is lessened trust along ethnic lines, greater solidarity along ethnic and cultural lines. You sort of see an us and them splitting. In a sense, it doesn't make sense because these are not representatives of any community. These are individuals doing horrific things, but people will tend to band together. You saw that in the United States after September 11th attacks. You had a much stronger patriotism, nationalism, because people felt us was being attacked by them.
Randall, maybe you could pick up on this notion as Bruce just raised it of you would expect horrendous incidents like this to make people cower in their homes. Quite the opposite happened. So what does that say about trust today?
Well, I'm not sure we say we expect them to cower in their homes, but during the London Blitz, after 9/11, after 7/7, after all these horrific events, we always see people come out into the streets and show solidarity. So in fact, what we saw in Paris was wonderful, but I actually think it's sort of what we expect. The question, though, what does this do to trust? And the question, I think, playing on Bruce's comment, is does that we that's banded together include Muslims? That would be the question. Are they outside the we?
That's the question. How would you answer it?
Well, I think if you look at the opinion data since backing up 9/11, you've seen attitudes towards Muslims have worsened. There's more suspicion in Europe of Muslims than any other group. But that said, the vast majority of French citizens, around 80%, have positive attitudes towards Muslims. Muslims, and that line is actually getting better over time.
Bruce, let me get you to follow up on that. Does the we include Muslims in spite of everything in France today?
Yeah, I don't know. I don't know the France demographic data. It certainly should. Right? These are exceptional individuals and they're not representative. In the United States, there was a lot of anti-Muslim sentiment after September 11th. We saw it in individuals. We even saw it in the government, targeting Muslim communities, targeting mosques. So sometimes we say something and do something else. It can be hard. These are very, very base tribal feelings that we have that are probably as old as our species. And to be smart about them, to recognize that us includes everybody, including Muslims, takes an effort of will. It's important we do it, but I think it can be hard. And I mean, I hope people of France can get over the tribal instincts.
In spite of what Bruce just said, Randall, I do recall very distinctly George W. Bush, then the president at 9/11, going out and saying, please don't attack mosques. Please don't include, our Muslim friends and neighbors and so on in whatever fears you may have about Islam right now. So some targeting, but on the other hand, an effort to reinforce trust.
There was a rhetorical outreach. Islam is a religion of Islam is a religion of peace, Bush said, and the police in New York City poured into Muslim communities to protect them. On the other hand, what happened at Guantanamo Bay, the torture of largely Muslim groups, I think, did terrible things for attitudes to the United States and indeed for attitudes among Muslims in the United States. And that kind of ties into a bigger issue. What happens to trust depends as much on how these societies respond in the months and years after these events. That is as important as the days after.
Let me follow up on that with Bruce then. The world obviously is becoming more urban. We are spending more time in our daily lives, therefore more of us with more people who are not like us. What, in your view, does that do to this notion of trust in big, multicultural Western societies?
I think it expands it. I mean, you think of human history as an expansion of trust, from families to tribes to towns to cities to countries to peoples, ethnicities, and then the whole planet. I think we, over the centuries, have gotten better and more trusting. And living in a multicultural society, I think, is the best way to bring other people into us. If you live in a big city, us is very expansive.
Interesting, but certainly the level of trust in government has gone down significantly over the last half century, Randall. You'd grant that.
Oh yeah, absolutely, everywhere. And you see the sort of voting levels of voter involvement, electoral involvement declining in absolutely every country. But also, I think comparatively, what Bruce said might apply to North America, but you're seeing lower levels of trust between citizens and across ethnic groups in Europe than you are in North America. And I think that ties to something he did mention, which is contact. There's less interaction, less contact among different ethnic groups in Europe than there is in North America.
So they want to make sure I understand. Living in their enclaves, therefore less contact with each other, with different ethnic groups?
Well, actually, where they live doesn't matter. If you think of Toronto, Brampton is largely Indian, Markham is largely Chinese, certain neighborhoods are Jewish. Where you have interaction in North America is through work. And the important difference between Europe and America or Canada is not actually about culture, religion, Islam, it's about work. People here work. And the most meaningful contact for most of us is on the street or where we work. And where you have unemployment levels of 40% sometimes among Muslims within France, by definition, there's no contact with other groups.
Bruce, a follow-up on this issue. You say, given that we're living in more urban areas, increasingly multicultural, increasing contact with people who are not like us, you think that I think, if I heard you right, you say that enhances our trust of each other. However, our trust of government has certainly gone way down. I've got Pew numbers here, Pew Research numbers. Public trust in the government back in 1958, 73%. In January in 2013, I guess the question they ask is, do you trust the U.S. government to do the right thing? Down to 26%. We may be more trusting of each other, but we're surely not of government, right?
Well, but there's a lot of aspects of trust. There's individual trust, there's institutional trust, there's trust in systems, let's say the banking system, the press, government. And yes, we are at an all-time low in institutional trust, certainly in the United States. I think that's generational. That goes up and down with the decades. It's hard to know what's causing it and what'll cause it to change. But you are right in that we are not trusting government to do the right thing or even to be functional.
So if we have less trust in government today to do the right thing, Bruce, and we very much depend on government right now to deal with the issues, the likes of which we've seen in France over the last week, what does that all mean?
It means we have a problem. And you see the United States, you see with NSA spying. I mean, we're learning all of these things the NSA is doing in our name because of Edward Snowden. These are things we might not like. It's secret. The government says you have to trust us, and people are saying, no, we don't. So you have this disconnect between institutions we need to trust. They're not acting trustworthy, so we don't trust them, which is why you see things like young people disengaging in politics.
We need this trust, don't we, Randall?
We do indeed. And actually, I think it's complex, though, because you're right that we see these declining professed belief in trust. But when something horrific like Paris happens, the first institution to which everyone looks is the state.
Is the presidency, yes.
And the presidency and the institutions and the police. And the level of support you're seeing for the police, partly because 2 of them were killed in France, is absolutely astronomical. And it's hard to square that profound support for the state's reaction, and for the police in France with these declining levels of trust. So in a sense, the numbers might be slightly misleading.
It makes one wonder if you should take all of these numbers with a grain of salt. When you're asked, do you trust government to do the right thing? The knee-jerk reaction is to say, well, of course not, they're all a bunch of thieves.
Yeah, absolutely.
But when a terrorist incident takes place, we sure look to them and first responders to respond, right?
Exactly.
What a conundrum.
Exactly.
So what do we do about that?
Well, on the one hand, it's reassuring in the sense that when we need government, we can be confident, and we believe we can be confident, then it's there. And a moment like this is one of the ones in which we need it most. I think you're right. There's a huge bias in the questions, and also the 2% who actually answer those questions on the phones might not be representative of the overall population. One always has to bear that in mind.
Sure. Let's consider whether or not we're into a new normal here. And the Paris shootings seem to fall into a pattern of kind of homegrown terror attacks in a number of places in the Western world. And I'm going to put a short list up here so that we can remind ourselves what's gone down over the last couple of years. 2013, we'll go back just that far. There were, of course, the Boston Marathon bombings. 3 people killed and an estimated 264 others injured. That same year, British Army soldier Lee Rigby killed outside his barracks in London by 2 British citizens. October 2014, Canada comes into the picture. Saint-Jean-sur-Richelieu in Quebec, warrant officer Patrice Vincent killed by a Canadian citizen in a vehicular attack. And of course, 2 days later in Ottawa, Corporal Nathan Cirillo shot and killed outside the National War Memorial in Ottawa, also by a Canadian citizen. And then even more recently, in mid-December, an Australian citizen held customers and employees hostage at a cafe in Sydney. 3 hostages left dead in all of that. So as we consider this whole issue of trust then, Bruce, we have what appears to be a new threat insofar as it is low skill, low tech, almost quasi-suicidal, lone wolf in its nature. From what you've been able to determine so far, what kind of an impact is that having on the level of trust we have for each other, for institutions, for our neighbors that we don't know that well?
Well, it's certainly making people scared. And this isn't new. I mean, these sorts of attacks have existed and have happened over the centuries. We're just seeing them more now. We're compiling a list. We're generating a narrative that says this is a new type of threat. It actually isn't new. And what that's doing is making people scared. And you talked about trust in police, trust in the government. When people are scared, they turn to powerful authority figures. And that's going to be the police. That's going to be your nation's leader. That's going to be the military. So you're going to see this kind of trust. But that's because this is the narrative in our heads. I don't think this is new. I think you can compile the same list going back centuries, and it almost never happens compared to the handgun deaths in America. That is a rounding error. But now we have this story that this is new, and that does cause people to trust authoritarian figures more.
What's your view on that, Randall?
Well, I agree and I disagree. Violence is certainly not new, and terrorism is not new. But this sort of jihadism, which we're seeing in every country, and very interestingly, originating in very different class structures. Some are poor and deprived, some are students at York University, some are medical doctors. They are being convinced through propaganda, chiefly on the internet or in the prisons, that it is justified in the name of a kind of perverted conception of religion to go out and kill innocent people. And I don't think we should take anti-Semitism out of this. We talk about anti-Islamic sentiment, but 4 people died in Paris because they were Jews. And there's rising levels of anti-Semitism across Europe.
You're talking about the people in the kosher supermarket.
Absolutely, absolutely. And so while I entirely agree, violence is not new, terrorism not new, if we look at the last 30 years or so, this form is new.
What do we do about that?
Well, we partly do what we've been doing. I mean, we have to track them down and stop them before they commit crimes, track communication on the internet, track the prisons, and give the security services enough scope to combat this without hopefully throwing over our civil liberties overboard in the process.
Let me pick up on that with Bruce then.
Sure,
Bruce, again, in terms of maintaining trust, what does your research tell you about whether giving increased powers to the state in order to make us feel more secure is a way to increase trust across society?
I mean, it will increase trust. The question is it effective? I mean, the security research is what I do, and increased powers are not necessary. These attacks are not because the police are somehow blocked from enforcing the law or investigating crime. The thing about lone wolves is you can't possibly stop one. In the United States, a few years ago, we had someone at Fort Hood decide one morning to start shooting people. And that's not something that surveillance can help or monitoring certain groups can help. This kind of thing just happens. It happens occasionally, very rarely, but this is not a matter of new powers. In the United States, we're certainly, every time there is an event, there's push for new powers for police, new powers for government, but that is actually not what we need. That doesn't make us any safer. But it might make people feel better.
Randall, how about you? Do you agree it doesn't make us any safer?
Well, I agree that we don't need new powers and that security services can exploit that. Bruce is absolutely right. But no, it does make us safer. There have been dozens of plots across Europe, in Germany, in the United Kingdom, which have been intercepted and stopped because email communications have been read, and evidence of a desire to buy fertilizer or weapons or whatever has come out. And look, the security service is in a terrible position here. In Germany, precisely the same people that complain that the security services have too much power and are too intrusive complain that they failed to stop the Döner murders, these 8 or 9 Turkish people who were killed because they were by people who were part of a cell. So we absolutely need to confront this. We can make a difference. We can save lives, and frankly, that makes all the difference.
I thank Bruce Schneier and Randall Hansen for joining us on the agenda tonight and sharing your views with us after this horrendous last several days in France and the amazing outpouring that resulted from it. Thank you very much to both of you.
Support Ontario's public television. Donate at tvo.org.